Hello, friends. Here we are on day 3 of Arthurian April, and today we are going to discuss Arthur's foster brother, Sir Kay. Now, Sir Kay is one of the knights that most people tend to know, mostly because of the Disney film The Sword and the Stone. And in that film, he is Arthur's older foster brother who's totally a jerk. He has red hair and a big jaw, and he always says stupid stuff and calls Arthur Wart and shoves him around and is not a very nice person. But believe it or not, Sir Kay is actually one of the oldest knights. In fact, he, Bedivere, Gawain, and Arthur, they go back all the way to the Welsh triads and probably before. And their stories, probably more than anyone else's, move and change over time. So even though from really Chrétien de Troyes onward, it's pretty consistent that Kay is a total boor, B-O-O-R, not boor or boors, like Sir Boars. That'll be another episode. He is arrogant, stubborn, rude, mean, all of those things. But if you go back to the Welsh tales, it's quite different. In fact, one of my favorite things about the early Welsh stories of Arthur and Bedivere and Kay and Gawain in particular is that they all are imbued with almost superpowers. So all of them have really cool abilities. Some of them are very similar to the kinds of things that we see in other Welsh and Celtic stories from the British Isles and surrounding areas. Kay can apparently grow as tall as he wants at various times. He can hold his breath underwater for something like 8 days and 8 nights, like some sort of hibernating fish. I don't know. Seems to be able to come in handy. And he has a sword, I believe, that no one can heal from the wounds that he gives with them. So that also is kind of interesting. But in those stories, he's much more of a stalwart buddy to King Arthur. Now, by the time I get to Geoffrey of Monmouth and then later to Chrétien de Troyes in France, that does change. He really kind of codifies as a bully, but he's also got an important job. And this is one of my favorite things about the knights is that even though they're a bunch of manly men sitting around a table, they do have jobs. They do have things that they have to do. And for whatever reason, whether it's because he was raised with Arthur or just he's good at it, Kay is what's called a seneschal. Another word for seneschal is a steward, right? So his job was to basically take care of the goings on at Camelot in terms of how the castle functioned. This is super cool because it's like really practical, right? Even though these stories are completely wild in many, many ways, they're still fascinating because someone is thinking, wow, while all these men are out at war, somebody's going to have to make sure that all the deliveries are happening in the kitchen, all the right chairs are being pulled out for guests, all the beds are made, all the maids are paid. It's really interesting. But you also get the idea, like from Kay's perspective, he's got a regular job compared to all the other knights. Like his job has early mornings, clocking in, clocking out. It's like middle management, man. Not exactly the most fun thing in the world. So I guess deep down, I have a little bit of sympathy for the guy. No wonder he was a bit grumpy while everyone else was going on campaign and slaying dragons and searching for grails and finding castles full of women. He was pretty much stuck at Camelot taking care of the underbelly. And speaking of women, even though most of the knights are pretty much associated throughout most of their legends with various women, almost every single knight has some companion, some woman or women that become either his lovers or his wife or the object of his affection. That's not really the case with Kay. There are a few instances of mentions, especially early on, that he has a wife and maybe children. But for the most part, he's kind of, the single guy in the castle taking care of his foster brother's dirty business. And I just think that's rather fascinating. One of the super amusing things about Kay, and this is common between him and other folks as well, because keep in mind, the Arthurian romances are sort of being written down in a time where there is no standardized language. There's no standardized spelling in language. There's tons and tons of dialects in English and in French and in German and sometimes Italian where these stories are being told. And so even though Kay has a single syllable name with 3 letters, it can be spelled a number of ways. Just as an example right here. So K-A-Y, which most of us are familiar with, K-C-A-I, which is what I chose in my book, C-E-I-C-H-E, and K-E-Y-E. So that's just a couple of them that show up in different ways. And that's by no means unusual. Now, one of the earlier tales, which I've mentioned before, is Cullach and Olwen, which is a wonderful story in Arthuriana if you ever have the chance. But when they are approaching, so Kay is hanging out, of course, with Bedver and with Arthur, and they're basically storming the fort of the giant. The giant's wife comes up to greet them, and Kay has the forewithal to think, wow, this huge woman is probably going to squeeze me to bits if I'm not careful. And so he picks up a log, and instead of hugging him to bits, she takes the log between her arms and it sort of twists with all of her strength. And he says, quoth Kay, "Woman, had it been I thou dost squeeze in this wise, there were no need for another to love me ever. An ill love that." So recognizing that if that log had been him as intended, he'd never love again because there would be nothing of him to love. There's always such wonderful, hilarious moments in Arthuriana. And although Kay might not be the most hilarious of all, and sometimes can be a little bit of a wet rag, wet noodle, I don't know. It's neat to see how these stories and these characters come to be. So maybe next time you watch The Sword and the Stone, you'll have a little bit more sympathy for grumpy old Kay.